And now we cross over to our Young for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Well, made of tiny blocks of silicon, cobalt and copper, semiconductors power almost every electronic device in the modern world, from electric toothbrushes and smartphones to driverless cars and military weapons. As tensions between the United States and China intensifies, Washington has been seeking to forge a network of like-minded partners to cooperate on the latest technologies and, of course, cut Beijing out of its semiconductor supply chain. But first, it has to gain a strong advantage in chip technology and work with Asia's largest chip makers, TSMC and Samsung, which currently dominate the global market. We take a look at what the growing battle for chip supremacy means for this part of the world. And for this, we connect with Darryl West, Vice President of Governance Studies and Senior Fellow of the Centre for Tech Innovation at the Brookings Institution. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. West. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
Well, thank you again. And well, first of all, for our viewers who might not be so familiar with the issue, what is the importance of having superior semiconductor technology? A lot of nations are rushing to just develop the next generation chips. And well, what is the significance of this, especially in the context of the U.S. China rivalry?
I mean, the chips are important for trade, commerce, security, and innovation. As your introduction suggested, advanced semiconductors are used in virtually all electronic products. They're used in many different sectors. I think in Korea, 1/3 of your exports come in the form of semiconductors. So obviously, it's very important for your economy. In the United States, it's critical for our efforts at technology innovation. Virtually every advanced technology in terms of AI and data analytics rely on chips in some sense. So the China angle is important from a security standpoint. Obviously, there's a lot of concern in the United States about security vis-a-vis China. And so that's an aspect that everybody in Washington, D.C. is keeping a close eye on.
And now, of course, we're seeing rising tensions near the South China Sea and along the Taiwan Strait. And while there are worries in Washington that Beijing might gain control of Taiwan's massive semiconductor capacity, how real would you say these concerns are? And what would be the ramifications should they occur?
Well, if that happened, the ramifications would be quite severe because, as you suggest, most of the semiconductors come either from Taiwan or South Korea. And so if there were problems with the supply coming from either of those areas, it would create enormous difficulties in the United States, the European Union, and other places around the world. So the whole geopolitical situation in that part of the world has grown very complicated. There's been a lot of tension, even with the arrival of a new Biden administration in the United States. There still is a lot of concern about the U.S. China relationship.
Well, undoubtedly, the U.S. leads the world in nearly all areas of high tech. But when it comes to semiconductors, though, a lot of companies have decided to go fabless. And it's said that the U.S. lost its semiconductor manufacturing to Taiwan and South Korea decades ago. Well, how does America then intend to ramp up its capacity and regain that competitive advantage?
I mean, there's a lot of interest in the United States in what we call onshoring, kind of boosting our domestic capabilities in a lot of different critical areas, and semiconductors certainly would fall within that area. So there is legislation pending in the United States before Congress that would invest up to $50 billion in building new fab manufacturing facilities in the United States. There's just concern that so much of the world's dependence falls on two countries that I think there's interest both in Europe as well as in the United States in boosting domestic capability just so that we are less reliant on other countries.
And well, in the US, President Biden introduced the so-called CHIPS Act, which aims to really ramp up domestic production, also create jobs, and overall just expand America's capacity and technological ability to produce the next generation chips. But, well, there are some critics, though, saying that these businesses don't need all that support and taxpayers' money because it is in their interest to pursue innovation and secure supply chain networks anyway. So what is your view on this, Dr. West?
I mean, businesses certainly are interested in pursuing innovation, but what we've seen over the last few decades is a very heavy corporate reliance on outsourcing. So big parts of the global supply chain have gone outside the United States. A lot of the manufacturing capabilities have gone to various places in Asia. And of course, during the pandemic, we saw some of the problems with that. So now there's an interest in the government playing a role. Part of that legislation that you cite would increase public investment in building fab manufacturing facilities within the United States, and then also giving private companies incentive to invest their own dollars in manufacturing capabilities. So a part of that legislation would create investment tax credits as an incentive. So we do feel that companies need to be encouraged to reshore jobs back in the United States in these critical areas, and semiconductors clearly is one of the most important for a variety of different sectors.
And while the likes of Samsung and TSMC, they've been quite enthusiastic about expanding production in the US. And well, they're going to be working with US companies too, like Intel. So they're going to be cooperating to an extent. But at the same time, these companies, they are fierce rivals. So they're also going to be competing with each other. How do you expect this collaboration and rivalry to play out?
I mean, the good news is we actually need both companies, and we need good relations with both of those countries as well, because both are absolutely crucial for semiconductors and therefore very important for our efforts at technology innovation. As you mentioned earlier, the United States does extremely well on technology innovation, and it's really central to the new economy that is emerging. But obviously, we want to maintain our strong lead in that area. We see the United States having many competitive advantages. So it's very important for the United States to maintain good relations both with Taiwan as well as Korea.
Well, some are concerned that as multiple countries, including the United States and South Korea, of course, and even those in the European Union, intending to become self-reliant in chip technology and really ramping up their domestic production, do you possibly see greater protectionism or possible trade conflicts arising over this?
Well, the United States and Europe are interested in boosting our domestic capabilities, but it takes up to 10 years to build these really sophisticated manufacturing capabilities in the semiconductor area. So there's no risk of anything happening in the short run that would create problems for Korean companies. At least for the next 5, if not 10 years, we're going to need those chips, and so therefore that trade relationship is going to be very important. It may be 10 years down the road, the U.S. will have a stronger manufacturing capability, but that is a very long-term goal. It takes a long time to build those types of capabilities.
Well, for now, the United States and South Korea are facing supply chain issues, and they've together agreed to ramp up cooperation on semiconductor technology, making sure there's enough being produced and also enough going around. And while they've even set up a hotline for regular communication to make sure that the supply chain is resilient. But in other ways, how do you see the two sides working together on semiconductors?
I think they will continue to work together very closely, just because semiconductors are so crucial to our entire digital economy that is growing as a proportion of the overall economy. COVID, in fact, has accelerated technology innovation. People in the United States had to shift to online learning, telemedicine, remote work, and e-commerce. So all those platforms have grown quite substantially over the last 2 years. Even if COVID gets under control this year, those advances are still going to be there. So the United States needs a strong semiconductor sector. We need good relations with Korea, because that is very central, both from an economic standpoint as well as a security standpoint.
And of course, Washington's been emphasizing the importance of working together with like-minded countries here in the Indo-Pacific. And well, at the moment, it seems Taiwan's TSMC, they've been forging closer cooperation with US and Japanese companies. And that's been slightly worrying for South Korea's Samsung. And amid Seoul and Tokyo's diplomatic feud that started in 2019, it's been no secret that Japan would prefer not to have South Korea as involved in Quad Plus or the CPTPP or other regional initiatives. Although South Korea has admittedly wavered when it comes to choosing between Washington and Beijing, and not aligned itself as strongly as Japan and Taiwan might have done with the US, do you think the country is being sidelined here?
Not at all. The United States needs a strong relationship with South Korea. I don't see anything happening in the next few years that's going to change that. That relationship is vital for U.S. economic development. It's definitely vital in terms of security. There are many new military and defense applications in AI, machine learning, and data analytics that depend on semiconductors. So the United States needs to maintain that close relationship, and I would be shocked if there was anything different that happened in that area.
And well, as the US sets out to build this network of like-minded countries that will cooperate in areas of emerging technologies, not just semiconductors, of course, but also AI and 6G. There seems to be a lot of those buzzwords there, but at the same time, it's all very broad at the moment. How do you think such cooperation should look like? I mean, what are the kind of goals or areas that they should really narrow down and focus on?
I mean, I think there will be many areas of cooperation in all the new technologies that you're talking about. The United States very much wants strong relationship with countries that share our values, and that includes values of democracy and freedom and liberty. And so, President Biden is working very closely to rebuild relationships with European allies, but also countries such as Japan and South Korea. We need to basically come to agreements on trade, on economic competitiveness, on innovation, and on security issues. And certainly, everybody's keeping a very close eye on China and its emerging power. And so that's the reason Biden is very focused both on countering that threat, but also having very strong relationships with our traditional allies.
Well, it seems that many countries in the West, also here in the Indo-Pacific, including South Korea, now seem to sense that perhaps it's not going to be beneficial in the long run to have such close technological or trade ties with China. And, well, despite this deepening divide between US allies and China, trade with Beijing hasn't exactly shrunk. And even Washington's staunchest allies like Japan, they're still doing business with Beijing. Do you think decoupling is really possible, and will Mr. Biden continue to pursue this?
I don't think we're going to see decoupling in the next few years because it takes years to set up manufacturing capabilities. These global supply chains have been in place for a number of years. We can't just kind of shift them overnight. It really takes a number of years to develop new global supply chains, new suppliers, new manufacturing facilities, and new distribution facilities. So I think that's one of the reasons why trade with China has actually stayed at a rather high level. That in the short run, you can't really change those types of relationships. It really takes a long time to do that. So over the course of, let's say, the next 5 years, that may start to change. But there certainly is not going to be decoupling in the next 1, 2, or 3 years, just because it takes a long time to rebuild new kinds of relationships.
Well, now it's almost been 1 year since Mr. Biden took office. And, well, many were expecting him to reverse a lot of Mr. Trump's trade policies. At least that's what we were hoping for here in the Indo-Pacific, I suppose. But we didn't see many trade initiatives from Mr. Biden over the past year. And it's been made quite clear that Washington won't be joining the CPTPP. Do you think the US is going to create its own trade networks or groupings in the Indo-Pacific?
I mean, you're right that Biden has not really emphasized new trade relationships. There have been some bilateral things, but it's very complicated politically within the United States because trade is such a hot button, because trade conveys the loss of U.S. manufacturing jobs, growing dependence on foreign suppliers of goods and services. And so, all of the political arguments that former President Trump made about trade and dependence on foreign suppliers, that is still part of American public opinion. So Biden has actually been surprisingly cautious on those fronts. As you point out, he hasn't really made radical changes in those areas, in part because the politics are complicated. Trade is still a controversial topic within the United States. And of course, there's always the possibility of a Biden-Trump rematch in the 2024 presidential election. And so I think Biden will move forward very cautiously in this area.
I see. Well, that was Darrell West, Vice President of Governance Studies and Senior Fellow of the Centre for Tech Innovation at the Brookings Institution. It was wonderful and fascinating to speak with you, sir. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.